Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are now coming to the awkward 30 seconds of the evening when we prepare to go live. So if I could ask people to, thank you. I'm Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and I'd like to welcome our global audience virtually, as well as our distinguished colleagues in person, to the opening event of our joint conference with the IMF Fiscal Department, excuse me, on fiscal policy after COVID, lessons and changes. My voice is fortunately given out at exactly the right moment. Let me ask Karen Dynan, who is one of the three co-organizers of the conference, to introduce our moderator and our speaker. Thank you, Karen.
Hello to everyone who is here and everyone who is with us online. I want to echo Adam's welcome. We're really excited to have people here, and we're excited about the program tonight and also the program we have tomorrow as well, which is full of good stuff. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight, who's Victor Gaspar. Victor is director of the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF. He joined the IMF in 2014. And before that, he had a very important role. He was Portuguese Minister of State and Finance, from 2011 to 2013. So as people probably recall, those were very interesting and important times in countries like Portugal, because this was the period of the sovereign debt crisis. Vitor has also held a variety of distinguished and important positions in European and Portuguese institutions. He was head of the Bureau of European Policy Advisors at the European Commission. He was director of research at the European Central Bank. He was Director of Economic Studies and Statistics at the Central Bank of Portugal, and he was Director of Economic Studies at the Portuguese Ministry of Finance. So what a resume, and what a kind of great person to be moderating tonight's conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Vitor.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here for this conference jointly organized by the Peterson Institute and the IMF to reflect on fiscal policy going forward. Definitely one of my favorite topics. It is my privilege to introduce Larry Summers, the Charles W. Eliot University Professor and President Emeritus at Harvard. Larry has a degree from the MIT back in 1975. He has a PhD from Harvard back in 1982. In 1993, he was awarded the John Bates Clark Medal, awarded every 2 years to an outstanding economist under 40. So you now know for a fact that Larry was under 40 once. Larry is also famous for various positions that he held here in Washington, D.C., and I will only mention Secretary of the Treasury in the Clinton administration and Chief Economist at the World Bank. Larry is a Vice Chair here at the PIIE Board of Directors. Now, I'm not going to say anything else, but I want to say that Larry is probably the best person in the world to speak to us about the future of fiscal policy, because a number of years ago, Larry was very much concerned about secular stagnation and that fiscal was not supportive enough to deliver macroeconomic stability and inflation at target. And more recently, Larry has been concerned about excessive fiscal stimulus and possible excessive effects from fiscal policy on inflation right now. And I'm even hopeful that Larry will be volunteering to speak about those issues tonight. Larry, please.
Vitor, thank you for that generous introduction, sort of alleging that I contradicted myself and asking me to worm my way out of it. Since you are the head of the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department, you owe me at least a small debt because I think I am the senior policymaker who did the most to popularize the idea that, at least for a long time, IMF stood for it's mostly fiscal. And if that's true, that makes your department absolutely central. It is good because that you mentioned that I was Secretary of the Treasury and Vice Chair of the Peterson Institute for International Economics Board, because if you hadn't, Adam would have required that I do that. It is an enormous privilege to be back at the Peterson Institute, which I think over many years has contributed a great deal to economic thinking. Keynes has a famous line about everything that policymakers say or do is the reflection of a defunct academic scribbler. For a time, I used to paraphrase that line by saying it was a fax from a Washington think tank, but that line too has become obsolete. And so now everything that a policymaker does is from a blog or a Substack that comes from a think tank. And I think that no think tank in Washington does a better job than the Peterson Institute of simultaneously being relevant and being rigorous. It is easy to be rigorous. It is easy to be relevant. It is actually quite hard to be both. And I think the Peterson Institute does a fine job of doing that. And part of that is topic selection. And it's hard to imagine a more pressing topic for macroeconomic reflection than fiscal policy. What I thought I could best do tonight to set the stage for your discussions tomorrow was reflect on the U.S. fiscal policy challenge going forward and to share my concerns and share my sense of the directions in which I think things need to move and why I have the perceptions that I do. And then perhaps in the question period, we can reflect more on the broader macroeconomics of fiscal policy. First, the good news, of which there's not going to be very much in this talk. I think we had an outcome on the debt limit that so far looks to me to have been in the 85th or 90th percentile of what I would have thought was likely 2 months ago. We are now extremely unlikely to default. We turned away closer from the edge of the ledge than I would have guessed was likely. Some of the policy contained is, in my view, actively good. More liberalization on permitting is, I think, a positive thing. Some of it is debatable. The extension of work requirements, which I think in some cases probably does serve a useful function. Some of it is, in my view, unfortunate, particularly the $20 billion that has been removed from the IRS, which I think will facilitate immoral tax cheating and expand deficits over time. And some of it is less unfortunate, the cutting of the domestic discretionary budget. But all things considered, a reasonable outcome that pushes the problem out for several years puts us in a very good place. What it does not do is change by very much the long-run fiscal posture of the United States. And that's what I want to talk about. And to start with, I want to offer a bit of historical perspective. In 1993, the country was seized with the importance of deficit reduction. Concerns about the deficit were substantial and were seen, rightly, as judged by what happened next, as significantly pushing up long-term interest rates, reducing asset values, and impeding capital formation. At that time, the CBO did not do long-term budget forecasts. It only did 5-year budget forecasts, and the 5-year out budget deficit forecast was 4.5% of GDP. In 2011, the nation was again seized with the importance of the budget deficit as a major issue. Probably the scariest debt limit crisis we've had took place. The Simpson-Bowles process was initiated. There was great sorrow in many quarters that that process did not ultimately bear fruit. At that time, the 10-year ahead deficit forecast was 3.2% of GDP. The primary deficit forecast was 0.1% of GDP 10 years out, and the debt to GDP ratio was anticipated to be 77% of GDP 10 years out. Where are we today? If you look at the CBO's numbers, and I will have some words to say about the CBO's numbers in just a few moments, the CBO's numbers say that the 10-year ahead deficit is 7.3%, more than twice what it was at the time of Simpson-Bowles. The CBO forecast says that the primary budget deficit is 3.6% of GDP, so large rather than essentially zero at the time of Simpson-Bowles. And the CBO says that the debt to GDP ratio will be 119% of GDP and rising rapidly when we get to 2033. Are those numbers likely to be right? There is enormous uncertainty in any 10-year ahead deficit forecast, quite apart from anything that policymakers do in the interim, simply from economic uncertainty and from uncertainty arising from what a given set of laws and policies will end up costing. But there are at least 4 factors that seem to me to suggest that the 7.3% estimate is very likely too low. First, the assumption underlying that is that the 3-month Treasury yield will average 2.3% through the whole of the 2020s and the early 2030s. That is almost 3% below its current level. My best guess would be 4% would be a better estimate given the magnitude of debt accumulation, given that inflation is more likely to be above 2 than to be below 2. But let's push the interest rate up by 1% in making the forecast. And that adds about 1.3% of GDP to the deficit. So now we're at 8.6. The CBO assumption, which reflects currently stated policy, is that national defense spending in the United States, which is 3.5% of GDP now, will fall to 2.8% of GDP by 2033, even as China's defense spending continues to increase at a rate of about 7% a year. That defense spending as a share of GDP will be substantially lower than the high 3s that it was in the 1990s, when it was generally regarded as a unipolar moment and we had no credible adversary. My guess is that 2.8 is likely to be 3.8 in the absence of major conflict. That adds another 1% of GDP to the deficit, and actually a bit more once you recognize that if defense spending is higher, then there's interest, then there's extra debt. So it's actually more like 1.3% again. So 1.3 for interest, 1.3 for defense. Now we're at 9.9. CBO's latest forecast was made in February. Since that time, revenues in the first 4 months of this year have come in about 1% of GDP below what was expected. In 4 months, 1% of 1 year's GDP low, albeit those are months when tax collections are usually larger because of the April 15th filing date, though there's estimated tax and there's withholding. Assume that, in fact, that technical is not 1% over 4 months, which would be 3% a year, but assume it's 0.5% a year. 9.9 plus 0.5 is 11.4. Finally, CBO, along with its mandate, assumes that all of the Trump tax cuts that are scheduled to go out in 2025 will, in fact, go out. That is not, to my knowledge, the expectation of any well-informed political observer, and is inconsistent with the president's commitment to no tax increases on anybody with an income under $400,000. Assume 2/3 of them remain, that's about another 0.5%. We are now at 11% of GDP, and some number, perhaps 145% of the debt to GDP. Is there anything equally large on the other side? Maybe AI will produce a productivity boom, but there's already an assumption in the forecast of total factor productivity mean reverting upwards relative to its performance so far in the 21st century. Maybe we'll get good luck on healthcare costs, but there has been a small miracle of healthcare costs restraint over the last decade, which people assume is going to continue in terms of the growth rate, and mean reversion to the longer term mean strikes me as more likely. So I think we are looking at 11% of GDP budget deficit, and that is something very substantially greater than we have faced historically in terms of out-year budgets. What can we say about its solution? I think the least remarked, but to me, fairly evident truth is that the changing structure of economies means that different people will have different values and different assessments of efficiency versus equity and the like, and will therefore have different views as to what the size of government should be. But I would submit for your consideration that for any given set of values, you should believe that government should be substantially larger over the next decade than it has been over the last generation. And I say that for four reasons. First, mechanically, the debt is much larger, so the interest will be much larger, and interest spending will be larger. Second, a substantial part of what government does is take care of people who are old. More than half the budget goes to Social Security, Medicare, and the component of Medicaid that is for long-term care. The share of the population that is over 65 was 12% in 1990. It has largely reached its new level, which will be 22% in 2030. A far older society with constant values requires that far more be devoted to the aged. There is no reason that I can see why the fact that a substantially larger fraction of the population is aged should convert anything like one-to-one into cuts in support for the aged. Now, there is a different calculation one can do that I did some years ago and I have not repeated recently, which is to say, well, 65 is the new 55, and so we shouldn't think about it that way. And the right way to think about it is to think about how many people are within 15 years of life expectancy, or how many people are within 10 years of life expectancy, and to track aging that way in some way that is taking account of these trends. Let me make a long story short and say there's basically no relief from the calculation from doing that. There are a variety of ways of doing that calculation, but you won't get any substantial relief, and you'll get even less relief if you recognize that for the lower half of the population, life expectancy is no longer substantially increasing in America. More interest, an older population. The third thing is that the relative price of what government buys has gone way up. Let me use a tendentious example that exaggerates the point but makes it clear. In 1983, the BLS normalizes components of the CPI so that they were all 100 in 1983. Using that normalization, the price of a quintessential consumer good, actually a somewhat selected by me consumer good, a color television set, is now 4. The price of a day in a hospital or a year in a college is now above 600. So there has been a change in the relative price of color television sets, a quintessential private good, and hospital care or education by a quintessential government good by a factor of 150. Now you can mess with that calculation. You should say you should use goods versus services. You can do all of that, and maybe you'll get it from 150 to 1 down to 3 to 1, or even 2 to 1. But the basic point that the relative price of the stuff government buys, which is basically all services, is got to be right, and that means the size of government is larger. And the last point, which is a bit different, is just the defense point. Whatever your view about national security, maybe you think we always spend too little on national security, too much on national security, but whatever your view is about national security spending, I don't see how you can think that we don't need to spend considerably more over the last decade than we did during the 1990s, given the set of threats that have arisen both in the European and in the Asian theaters. So all of this is to say that the idea that this challenge can be dominantly met on the spending side is, I think, not a plausible vision unless one wants to adopt values that are far more anti-government than those that prevailed when, for example, Ronald Reagan was president of the United States. It is only by having views that are far more anti-government than his that one could defend an 18 or a 19% of GDP spending share. The conclusion is that the United States will, over time, in ways that are largely not recognized by the political process, be likely to require substantial increases in revenue. Here's a way of thinking about some relevant magnitudes in that regard. The total AGI of all of those in the top 1% of the AGI distribution, so people making more than about $500,000 a year, is about 10% of GDP, of which we currently extract about 3.5% of GDP. If you took the moment of peak extraction from the top 1% in American history, it would be a little bit less than 50%. So if you returned to the days of maximum progressivity, 90% top rates, 70% top rates, you might get another 1.5% of GDP, and you might get as much as 1% from corporations that is incremental to that. But the maximum that is sort of imaginable is 2.5% of GDP from the high end. And I am not even considering the political constraints that would affect any such calculation. Conclusion is that we have a challenge before us that is of a magnitude that is unprecedented in our own history, but is not at all unprecedented in the history of the world, where Vitor has been part of IMF efforts to collaborate with countries reducing structural deficits by very substantial magnitudes as a share of GDP on many different occasions. But I don't think the magnitude of this potential challenge is greatly appreciated in the context of the US debate. The good news is that while it is clearly untenable to run forever with 10%, 11% budget deficits as a share of GDP, along with price stability, there is probably not substantial urgency in resolving this trajectory. The United States is fortunate in its extraordinary dynamism. It is fortunate in the set of circumstances that cause the share of US market value of equity in global market value of equity to be far higher right now than it has ever been historically. It is fortunate in the attractiveness of US capital that has led the dollar to reach a real exchange rate that is not that much lower than the epic, what were seen at the time as the epic highs that brought the Peterson Institute to prominence with its efforts surrounding the Plaza Agreement in 1985. And we are fortunate that even with this accumulation of debt, real interest rates are likely to be lower than we had become accustomed to their being during the 1980s and 1990s. So there is time to recognize and address this problem, and there is enormous uncertainty, and so it is always possible that there will be surprises that will cause it not to manifest itself. But I do not believe that the American policy debate is currently viewing the American fiscal position in a way that is realistic and honest. And I think it will be necessary in coming years for there to be a quite substantial sea change in thinking. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Larry. It was a fabulous speech. I will come to the room in a second, but if you allow me, I will start with a couple of questions. But I want to tell you that I was not implying in any way that you were inconsistent. As a matter of fact, I'm of the view that given the unprecedented combination of expansionary monetary, financial, and fiscal that was put in place in this country and around the world as a response to COVID-19, you ended up getting, through means that you definitely did not desire, the type of fiscal support that you had in mind. And that led to a situation where inflation finally took off, and central banks were able to decisively abandon the zero lower bound or the effective lower bound. And once that occurs, it's only natural that somebody like you, that thinks about the macroeconomic policy mix in an integrated way, starts worrying about the contribution that fiscal policy makes to inflation. So no accusation of inconsistency whatsoever. But, Larry, I would love to understand, given the tension that you see in the long run between a fiscal policy with runaway deficits and the maintenance of price stability, bringing inflation back to target, how do you see the dynamic of inflation in the US in the short to the medium run?
There are two kinds of people. There are people who see every nuance, and then there are people who try to have a big picture view and stay focused on the big picture view and acknowledge that there's a lot of nuance, but treat it as a little bit peripheral. I am, for better or worse, the second kind of person. And so my view of this is something like the following. Coming into 2021, the United States had a projected GDP gap for the year of about 3% of GDP. It undertook, between the Trump stimulus passed in December and the Recovery Act stimulus passed in March, 14% of GDP in stimulus. And at the same time, it suggested to people that interest rates would stay at zero until 2024. And at the same time, it grew the Fed's balance sheet by $150 billion, $120 billion a month. And at the same time, there was a substantial overhang of $2.5 trillion in liquid assets from the money that people had not been able to spend. And COVID was going to end at some point, and there were going to be a set of economic dynamics that play out that were likely to play out not unlike those that play out in my vacation town of Truro, Massachusetts, every spring, where the economy goes from being in hibernation on May 1st to being all gassed up and running hard on July 1st. And the end of COVID was going to kind of generate something like that. And if you decided to put 15% of GDP in spending into Truro, Massachusetts, while that was happening, you would blow the thing out. And that's kind of what happened. And then it was enough to blow inflation from being a little below 2 to being in the 4.5 to 5 range. And that was the basic big thing that happened. And then there was a lot of other stuff that happened, bottlenecks, used cars, oil prices, that caused inflation to look like it was 8 or 9. And then when that stuff was going away, it was kind of negative, so that could cause inflation to look like it was below 5. But basically, we were a 5% underlying inflation country by September of 2021. And that's more or less what we've remained, with a lot of other interesting stuff having to do with bottlenecking and unbottlenecking and markups and rising and markups falling. But basically, we've turned ourselves into about a 5% inflation country. And that's probably where we'll stay. Maybe it's a 4% inflation country until, we'll get some negative from housing that'll really be quite good. But then housing prices are rising again, so that won't stay as good as it's going to be for another year. So we're going to be a 4.5 or 5% inflation country until something happens that makes us be less. And for the last 60 years, there haven't been some things that happen that don't also involve substantial downturns in employment. It's conceivable that we'll get off much easier this time because there's more room for vacancies to fall than there usually is. So maybe vacancies can fall without unemployment rising. That's conceivable that there'll be some of that. But my guess is that the outlook is that aggregate demand will need to be restrained. Whether it's going to restrain itself because of the banking crisis and because of the lags of monetary policy, or whether we're going to need more, is not a question on which I have a confident view. I think that relative to what I thought a month ago, I would say it looks like lags plus banking crisis are having less restraining effect at present and in prospect than I would have guessed. So my guess is that Fed funds are going to have to get to a point 50 basis points or more ahead of where they are. I think it's kind of second order whether they get there 25 and 25 or 0 and 50 and 0 or 0 and 25 and 25. That people will be very extremely excited about that, but I think it's probably kind of second order. I think that if there was a little more fiscal restraint, and so there was a little less pressure for everything to happen with monetary policy, I think that might be healthier. But I don't think it's politically sort of realistic. And there's a huge analytical question that I don't really feel like I know the answer to, but I would know I would be forcing a staff to be producing an answer if I was in government, which is I mentioned this big drop in tax collections in the first 4 months of the year. If that sort of happened because somehow we're not collecting taxes and people are getting incomes, then that's like a big fiscal expansion. And that's like a bad thing in the context of an overheated economy. If that is happening because nobody's realizing capital gains and therefore nobody's getting cash in their pockets from realizing capital gains and is in the context of less selling in order to finance spending, then it's a partial mitigant to a thing that's restraining the economy. And one shouldn't think of it as a substantial kind of fiscal stimulus. And you could think of various other possibilities. And I don't understand it well enough, and the several people I've asked haven't understood it in a way that has made it clear to me. So that makes me somewhat hesitant about the near-term case. But I think the long-term fiscal policy issue is probably more profound than the shorter-term fiscal policy issue in terms of inflation.
Thanks so much. Larry, questions, comments? Caroline, please.
Hi, Caroline Atkinson, Peterson Board. Thanks very much to both of you. My question goes back to Vitor's remark about secular stagnation. And if you look ahead, do you think we've just said goodbye to secular stagnation? And if so, is that because of a shift in fiscal policy and fiscal outlook, or because of something else? Or might, and I know you and Olivier debated this, but
yeah, it's a good question. So in general, when people said to me, as many did in 2021, well, wait a minute, you used to be worried about secular stagnation, so how come you're worried about deficits now? I said, you know, I'm like somebody who was worried secular stagnation got invented in the late 1930s, and people were very worried about secular stagnation. And then we started fighting a war, and all of a sudden we were fighting World War II and spending a ton, and they weren't worried about secular stagnation anymore. That didn't mean they'd changed their minds. That meant the world had changed. And so that's broadly what was behind my change in thinking. But you're asking a different question. You're asking the question that's analogous to what was debated in 1943 and 1944, which when there was a big debate among economists about were we going to have a post-war depression, were we going to return to post-war secular stagnation, and were we going to need much larger deficits? And aren't we going to need that? And roughly all the smart people in Washington in late 1943 were confident that the big thing they needed to worry about was the post-war depression. And they turned out to be wrong for some reasons that are irrelevant now. Some of it is that during the war, we said nobody could buy a car. And because all the car factories had to make tanks. And more or less, nobody could buy a new house, because everybody was building the Pentagon and stuff. And so there was this huge pent-up demand. And that's not an important thing, right now. So I don't think one should know. One can know. But I guess the points that I would make are, one, I was always kind of careful to say, it feels like we've got a secular stagnation situation. There are a bunch of factors that can explain it, but who exactly knows how long it's going to last? Charles Goodhart was always worried me in before by saying, look, an aging society is a society with rising savings because everybody's worried about their retirement and there are more and more people worried about their retirement. But an aged society is a society with lower savings because everybody's decumulating their savings and selling their houses. And so maybe this isn't forever, this thing. So there was always, and rising inequality was doing a lot. But if you look at the trends in inequality, we have a huge inequality problem in America, but most of it most of it did not get made in the last decade. Matters a little bit whether you look at income or wealth, but most of it got made before. So some of the trends, so it's not completely clear where this was going, would be point one. Point two is that we are now having a big bout of, at least to hear the administration talk about it, a big bout of resilience investment. Because we've all decided just in time, not just in case, not just in time, and we need to bring back production here. And what's all that mean? That all means that we're basically going to obsolete a bunch of capital early and replace it, which means a big increase in investment demand. And to the extent we're having a large green transition, if we're going to spend, most people now think that the IRA's $400 billion price tag is way low relative to what it's actually going to be. But that's good because it means there's going to be lots more green stuff that gets invested in. But if you think the IRA price tag is going to be $1 trillion and you think each dollar of IRA is associated with another dollar of private spending, then you're looking at a fair amount of green investment. So you've got that. Then you have the fact that the debt to GDP ratio is already substantially higher. I don't think econometricians really know, but if you look at everybody's estimates and you look at people's calibrated general equilibrium models and you look at people who've done regressions of one kind or other, not a not unreasonable estimate would, and not one that's reaching to be high, would be that 1% of debt to GDP is 2 to 3 basis points on the interest rate. So if you say we're sort of 50 basis points up, that's like 100 basis points on the real interest rate. And then with some element of double count, but mostly not double count, an estimate would be that 1% of GDP in flow deficit is 30 or 40 basis points on the interest rate. And we've got bigger deficits than we used to. So if you take all that and the Fed thinks thought that the neutral real interest rate was 0.5% before, and that we were a 2% inflation country, so that the neutral rate was 2.5. If you take all the stuff I just said and you say that 0.5 is 1.5, that's not a particularly bold extrapolation from what I just said. And if you said, who knows, but maybe inflation will come down to 2, but maybe it'll go back up again. And then you said 2.5% for inflation. And then you said 1.5 plus 2.5 makes 4. That doesn't seem like it's a particularly adventurous or bold set of assumptions to make. And that's why I say I think we're likely to be in a substantially higher interest rate world than we were. And I also think there are some reasons to think that spending is becoming less interest sensitive. If you look at the average duration of capital that's put in place, it's now much more computers and software and much less office buildings than it used to be. And so the longer lived the thing, the more interest rate sensitive it is. So if you're going to have less interest rate sensitivity and you need to restrain the economy more, that's a reason why you're going to need to push interest rates even higher. So that's why I'm not particularly secular stagnation oriented going forward, but not with complete conviction. I tend to find myself more credible when I think something that I find uncongenial than when I think something that I find congenial. And so the idea that my secular stagnation theory was the key to the universe, understanding the economic universe for another decade, was kind of a highly congenial view. But I couldn't really convince myself that that was the right reading of the evidence. And so I tend to put more weight on my analysis when it rejects what I would prefer to believe than when it confirms what I would prefer to believe. So that's kind of how I analyze it, Carolyn. Yeah.
Thank you for it. My name is Masaki Shiraka, a former governor of Bank of Japan. I have a question about interlinkage between monetary policy and fiscal policy. The specifically rationale for having 2% inflation target. The typical argument goes the central bank is constrained by the presence of effective lower bound. Therefore, central bank needs safety margin for not slipping into effective lower bound. But now we found that fiscal policy was effective in raising inflation for better or worse. And if that is the case, then it is possible to argue that we don't need having 2% safety margin. And what do you think of this kind of argument?
I'm not sure. Because of the acoustics, I'm not sure I completely understood the argument. Do you?
I believe that the gist of it is to discuss the rationality of the inflation target. And if you have a situation where you believe that the neutral interest rate has gone up, you don't need as much of a buffer, and therefore the case for inflation targeting is weakened. Is this okay?
That is exactly right.
That's right.
So to the extent that you would say that, it's interesting. I had almost all the, let me see if I'm thinking about this right. Almost all the discussion is of the form, we should raise the inflation target, coming from people who think that it is painful to have recessions and they don't want to have a recession, and 2%'s not that big a deal. And besides that, 2% got set in the 90s, and we now think that neutral rates are lower than, even if we think they're higher than they were before, we think they're lower than they were in the 90s. So if 2% was right in the 90s, maybe 3% is right now. You're making a different kind of argument. You're saying if we really think we've got fiscal policy as a super potent stabilization tool and we've shown we're prepared to use it, that would be an argument for turning 2 into 1.5. That would be an argument for turning 2 into 1.5. I invite you to try that argument on Capitol Hill. or in the political provinces in the United States. I guess my real view of this is that I think it was a mistake to declare a numerical target. My view was, my broad view, I've said this many times, is my broad view is that Paul Volcker and Alan Greenspan understood what the Delphi oracles understood, which is that if everybody thinks you're omniscient and omnipotent, it's a good idea to speak vaguely, infrequently, and in an oracular way so as to preserve the illusion. And therefore, you should not get engaged in specific numerical targets. You should not get engaged in predicting your future actions and laying out what they're going to be. And you should, just because even if you're great, you're going to be wrong a lot, and that's just going to do a lot of damage to your credibility and not going to be helpful, and that you can't specify, you shouldn't specify what you're going to do, because what you're going to do depends on what happens. So then you say, well, you should specify your reaction function, but you can't specify all the things that might happen because there are always surprises. And so you just need to step back to humility, is my broad view. And when the Fed wanted to announce the 2%, they came to the Obama administration when I was in it, and my view was we should tell them no, that if they want to say price stability, that's fine, but we should not choose a numerical target. Tim Geithner, who was the Treasury Secretary, argued at the time that he didn't know whether I was right or whether I was wrong, that specifying a specific number was a bad idea, but he thought part of our broad compact with the Fed was that if they wanted to specify a numerical target, we shouldn't stop them. And I thought that was a very reasonable, I'm not sure that would have been my decision, but I thought that was a very reasonable decision. And the president and the administration ultimately decided to bless the 2% target, and so we have it. But I can't get myself very excited about debating whether the number should be 1.5 or 2.5 or 1 or 3. What I would prefer to do is change the word target to range and leave it at that, and therefore try to gradually move off of having a target. I think we just have to appreciate that in macroeconomics, eras last 15 years. And so we just don't know what the nature of the problem and what the nature of the challenges were going to be. When I think back about silly judgments that I made at some point in my career that both turned out to be wrong, and when I look back at them, I think I should have known better. I regarded the liquidity trap as a historical curiosity through the 90s that might be relevant to Japan, but wasn't really going to be relevant to us. And I think in retrospect, I should have said, you never know what happens, and things have a way of sort of coming around in different ways. And so I think trying to lock in specific targets is a mistake. I think the point you're making is a helpful one because it points up something I hadn't really thought about before, which is that it's not completely obvious that if you took as a given that you wanted to set a target, that the ex-ante target today would be lots higher than the right target to have set sometime 15 or 20 years ago.
Thanks. Jeremy, please.
Thank you, Chairman Zettelmeier Bruegel. Going back to the scenario that you described in response to Caroline's question, I wonder what would happen to the US dollar in this setting, and is there a danger, given that the rest of the world, in particular Europe, is more fiscally constrained, that in its attempt to subsidize competitiveness of clean tech, the IRA is going to essentially cause a huge Dutch disease problem that kills the competitiveness of the unsubsidized portion of US manufacturing?
Jeremy, since your neighbor wants to intervene as well, perhaps we could go. Jean Pisani, please.
I'd like to go back to your sort of benign conclusion about the fact that in the US, perhaps the situation is serious, but there is room for increasing taxes. And my simple question would be, what's the political likelihood of increasing taxes?
I missed the last part of it.
Increasing
What the
taxes in
political
US.
likelihood
Is it
of
politically
coming
viable?
to an agreement to increase taxes?
And let's have these two questions, if that's okay, Larry.
One of the lesser surprises to me in the world is how strong the dollar is and how little complaint I hear from just, when I was in government in the 90s, the dollar was not nearly as strong as it is right now. And there were all kinds of people who were really upset about the dollar and its strength and it's deindustrializing America. Terrible. And I don't perceive, now some of that's because we got a 3.4% unemployment rate. If the unemployment rate gets to 5.5, then probably it'll be a bit different. But I am struck that the politics of an excessively strong dollar do not seem to me to be a very strong consideration in the United States, maybe in part because it is considered to be contributing to inflation restraint. I tend to be an optimist about the dollar because I think currency choices are largely about alternatives. And, Joe Biden has this line that he applies in the context of elections, where he always says it's not a choice about the almighty, it's a choice about the alternative. And I think something like that applies to the dollar, and I just don't see the world deciding that because of U.S. fiscal irresponsibility, they're going to be lots happier in an amalgam with the debt of an amalgam of European countries, or with the debt of an even more indebted than the United States aging Japan, or with the debt of China, given all the political risks. So I am not particularly worried that the dollar will be the forcing function, assuming as I do assume, that we have a reasonably responsible central bank. And I think we do have a reasonably I think we do have a reasonably responsible central bank. So I don't think we're headed back to a Carter era dollar kind of situation, and I don't think we're likely to get ourselves into a Louvre era kind of problem. You know, tax increases. I think there's a kind of lesson if you follow politics, which is that the transition from inconceivable to inevitable can sometimes be pretty rapid. If you kind of, you know, Milton Friedman's example, always, and Alan Greenspan's example, always of why economic research is so important and economic policy thinking is so important, was they were working on the volunteer army in 1966 or 1967. And at that time, the idea that we would switch to a volunteer army would have seemed at least as implausible as the idea of a $100 a ton carbon tax does today. But then with the Vietnam War and everything that happened, the whole world changed, and it turned out to have been a really valuable thing for there to be blueprints for a volunteer army. And I think there are a variety of examples that have that character. Think about if anybody had described that the United States would ever do something like the PPP program 4 months before the United States did the PPP program. So, you know, does major tax increasing look highly plausible right now? Of course not. But, you know, what can happen over time in different circumstances is, I think, a difficult thing. Is, I think, a difficult thing to judge.
Thanks so much, Larry. I want to give the complete quote from Milton Friedman, and I think that you're going to appreciate that. He basically says that it takes a crisis to make the political impossible into the politically inevitable. And Larry, it was absolutely brilliant to be with you on this debate. It's the best possible start for the debates that we're going to have tomorrow. Thanks so much for doing this, and please join me thanking Larry for his time and his wisdom.
Institute Board. Thank you, Vitor Gaspar, Director of the Department of Fiscal Affairs at the IMF. Again, this was the beautiful substantive launch, if a tad bit depressing, for our discussion of global perspectives on fiscal policy. We return to a broader global look first thing tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time, with a keynote by Gita Gopinath, the first Deputy Managing Director of the IMF, and then to a number of sessions, including luncheon keynote by Heather Bushi, member of the Council of Economic Advisors of the U.S. I hope you'll all join us, many of you in person, and many more of you online. All of the presentations are on the record and will be available online going forward, and we look forward to seeing you then. This meeting is closed. Thank you.
Larry, it was fabulous. Thank you.